Kia ora tātou. Hello, everybody. So my name's Melissa Robson, and my connection with the Selwyn Catchment was through the technical lead for a multidisciplinary technical team that was supporting Environment Canterbury and the Sewlyn Te Waihora Zone Committee through their limit setting and their ZIP addendum, Zone Implementation Program addendum process. So what I'm going to talk about today is water quality in the Sewlyn Te Waihora catchment. And for the more astute among you, you'll see from the first slide that water quality isn't just about nitrogen. So I'm going to be looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, and bugs. I'll talk a little bit about some water quality data that we've got in the catchment state and trends, and then I'll spend some time talking about what's actually being done about it in the area. So nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, and bugs. So why are we interested in these? Why are we interested in them? We're interested for about nitrogen because at certain concentrations, it's either chronically or acutely toxic to aquatic species. We're interested in nitrogen also in terms of our own health. The World Health Organization has got a limit, 11.3 milligrams a litre for drinking water. So this is to protect us against risks of methemoglobinemia, which is blue baby syndrome. We're also interested in nitrogen in combination with phosphorus because of the fact that it can promote plant and algal growth in our aquatic ecosystems. So these are commonly used nutrients in the agricultural system for promoting and supporting improved plant growth, and they do exactly the same thing in our aquatic systems. We're interested in sediment, so sediment because of visual and recreational and amenity impacts, but also because high sediment loads can start to silt out some important aquatic habitats. And we're generally interested in bugs because they make us sick. So here's at the top there are a few photos of likely sources or of plausible sources for some of these contaminants. And the reason why I've put them up there is to show that they don't all come from a single land use. They don't all come from a single land type. They don't all just come from the agricultural sector. So these come from a range of different land uses and also from both urban and rural and domestic residential dwellings. So we're interested in water quality, but we're not just interested in water quality in and of itself. Water quality is also really important in an important factor in determining ecological health and cultural health. So ecologists talk about ecological health being like the seat on a three-legged stool. And the other legs of that stool, so the one is water quality, another one is water quantity, and the third one is physical habitat. So we need to manage all of those three if we're going to try and manage ecological health. And the same for cultural health. So this was a diagram, an eco-cultural diagram that Dr. Gail Tipper did for the Selwyn Te Waihora catchment. And what she did is she took the biophysical aspects of the catchment and overlaid aspects of cultural health and drew connections between them. So we've got water quality in the middle in the blue, and the various components of cultural health in the black with arrows pointing basically to show the connections. So we know these things are important, or they impact water quality, impacts on things that are of value to us. So how do we set about managing them? So after knowing the type of activities that generate them, we need to know how they move. So in general, not 100%, but in general, sediment and phosphorus move over the surface of over the land or in the shallow subsurface flow along with E. coli. And nitrogen generally, not completely, but generally moves down through the soil profile and either into shallow subsurface flow or down into groundwater. So knowing how these things move through the environment can also give us an important clue for managing is how quickly they're going to do that. So this is a sample of water that I took from a lowland stream in the Selwyn catchment this morning. So if we were able to take the bugs, the E. coli, out of here, and we were able to trace the E. coli when they were lost, we'd find that they were lost probably sometime during the Lions Tour or maybe during the America's Cup final. Okay, so quite recent. They have quite a quick die-off rate. But if we take another contaminant like nitrates, it's a completely different story. So nitrates, because of the way they move coming down through the soil and into groundwater, basically almost all of the catchment is hydrologically connected, so that it's connected in some way to water. And what we're likely to find in this same sample that we took on 20th of July 2017, that actually we could have nitrates in here that were lost on every single one of these days of these newspaper articles of world and national events. So we could have nitrates in this sample from the day that Nelson Mandela was jailed for terrorism, and in the same sample the day that he became president of South Africa. And so what this starts to do is it tells us that these managing different types of water quality contaminants can be quite complex. And in this case, certainly, it raises a really important management challenge, which is one of time lags. So it's something that we call nitrate in the post, and a really important management question is how much is actually in the post. So if we can have nitrates from all of these dates that already be traveling through the system, how much is actually still there to come? So, and accurately and honestly, we don't actually know exactly how much there is still to come in the post. But we've done some modeling, we've looked at some simulations, we looked at our conceptual modeling and the data that we have, and we think that if nothing changed, so if the land use stayed exactly as it is now, then we could see up to a 2 milligram a litre rise in nitrate nitrogen in the groundwater and also in the lowland streams, just as a result of what's already in the post. So now I'm going to have a look at a little bit of data. So having said that it's not all about nitrates, I am going to start with nitrates. So the bar along the middle is basically just a bar of increasing nitrate concentrations. And along the top, we've got some indicators or some standards of nitrate concentrations from chronic toxicity on the left. This is where sensitive species, aquatic species, start to do less well, start to be less successful, through to the national objectives framework and national bottom line at 9.8 milligrams a litre. The World Health Organization drinking water standard, and then through to acute toxicity, where we would start to see some fish mortality over on this hand side. And so what I've done is taken the water quality data of monitored streams in the Sewlyn Te Waihora catchment and just ranked them along the bottom. And so we go from Selwyn at White Cliffs with really quite low concentrations of nitrate, below a milligram a litre, through to Dawson Drain and Boggy Creek with really quite high concentrations of nitrate, above 8 milligrams a litre. So that's in terms of the state. This diagram, I think some of you have seen it before if you came along to Ken's presentation, but this looks at a trend. So it takes one of those sites, the Selwyn at Coes Ford, and looks at the trend over the last 35 or 40 years. And that's nitrates at low flow, so not during storm conditions. And so we see, and it won't come as a surprise to anybody, but we see a gradually increasing trend of nitrate nitrogen. So in the same vein, this is looking at aquatic species, so aquatic plant growth in the streams and rivers in the Selwyn. So some aquatic plant growth is really important. It's really important for food and really important for habitat. But at a certain point, it's deemed to go to become a negative influence, so starting to negatively impact on other values and starting to negatively impact on other species. And the regulations have got this sitting around about 50%. So these pictures, they're all pictures from streams within the catchment, going from maybe about 5% on the left-hand side through to about 100% coverage on the right-hand side. And what I've done again is I've ranked over the last 5 years. I've ranked the streams that we monitor for their average 5-year maximum aquatic plant coverage. And so again, Coes Ford, Wainiwa on the left-hand side being really quite low, which is what we would expect, through to the Lee and the L2 on the other side, where we see consistently very high amounts of aquatic plant cover. So onto bugs, so onto contact, which is one of the reasons why we monitor bugs, is for suitability for contact recreation. So ECAN samples contact recreation in 5 places, and they sample it multiple times during a season, and they give an average grade over the whole season. And this is its suitability for us to be in the water, swimming and playing about in the water. So right from the top of the catchment at Glen Tunnel, the average grade for this year was good. And that's actually improved over the last 5 years. So we've gone from fair 5 years ago to a good grade in the last couple of years. As we come down the catchment to Chamberlain's Ford, again graded good this year, and that's been pretty consistent over the last 5 years. And we get down to Coes Ford, it's graded as poor for contact recreation, and that again has been consistent over the last 5 years. And at Upper Huts, it's been graded as very poor for contact recreation, and then again consistent over the last 5 years. And lastly, the last recreational site that ECAN monitor is the Lake Ellesmere Domain. So this was graded poor this year, and that's actually deteriorated over the last 5 years from good down to poor. And the last bit of data is an indicator of stream ecosystem health. So this is an index that, with the way you sample is you sample, take a few samples of bugs in the stream. You count them and you classify their what type of bugs they are according to whether they're tolerant or not of polluted water. And so the index goes from above 6, which is excellent, to below 4, which is poor. And again, we've taken data over the last 5 years and done an average of it, and we see very much the catchment split into 2. So there are half of the sites that are at excellent or good. And actually, Selwyn at Coes Ford for the first 3 years of the sampling was at excellent, but the last 2 years have been incredibly poor, with a very, very low water quantity as well, which has brought it down just to good. And then the other half of the site, the other 5 sites have been graded poor in terms of stream ecosystem health. So that was all I was going to talk about in terms of data, and I appreciate that will be entirely inadequate for many people who really wanted to see an awful lot of data. So there are a couple of other places that we can see that there is a good source of information. So one, there's an overview. ECAN does an overview of the state and trends in water quality of all of their water bodies in the region. The last one was done in 2013, and I think they happen every 5 years. I'm looking to see if there's anybody at ECAN. I think they happen every 5 years. But the other site, the Land and Water Aotearoa website, is actually a really great resource for looking at water quality. So you can drill down to the stream or to the river or to the lake that you're interested in, and you can see all of the water quality data, including the most recent water quality data, and also how it stacks up, so how it compares to other water bodies of a similar type. So those are a couple of really good resources. So the last bit, I'm going to move on to what's actually being done about it, being done about water quality. So first of all, it's basically, how do you decide what to do? So how does anybody decide what to do when they're trying to think about how they're going to deal with water quality? And we've talked about where some of the source activities. We talked about some of the source locations and the pathways, how these contaminants move. And this information starts to kind of set up the breadth of possible interventions that we could use. The traditional wisdom, I suppose, for managing diffuse pollution from agriculture is that you deal with it at source. That source mitigation is basically the best way that you deal with a diffuse water pollution problem. But actually, when you have catchments that have got really long lag times, or you have catchments with multiple water quality issues, you have catchments that with some places in the catchment kind of hold on to and store up nutrients, certain types of nutrients, that only looking at source mitigations is actually quite narrowing. So this is the opportunity we want to look at as many opportunities, all the plausible opportunities that we can think of come to the table at this point. And then, and the zone committee in this case needed to think about effective approaches. So putting ideology aside, think about for this particular catchment, for the particular water quality contaminant that people are interested in, what is going to be the most effective way of dealing with that? So, for example, for some of the phosphorus issues, the issue is very visible. Some of the solutions are very visible, you can see them, and it's really easy to see whether they've been effective or not. So in this way, those mitigations have been effective. So because of that, it might be, for dealing with phosphorus up to a certain point, targeted management practices can actually be a really effective way of dealing with them. Nitrate's something it's completely different. You can't see it happening. You can't see whether interventions that you've chosen to try and manage it have actually been effective. So sometimes we need to use a proxy, for example, a model, to tell us how effective our interventions are. And the last thing that zone committees needed to think about was how do these different interventions impact on each other and impact on other things that we value. So they really needed to think about the consequences of all of these different interventions across a wide range of values. So this is a list, and you'll be pleased I'm not going to go through all of this list, but this is a list of all of the different activities or interventions that I could think of that are going on at the moment in the zone. And these either come from the zone committee themselves and through their zone implementation program. They come through the Whakaora Te Waihora lake rehabilitation program. They come through the Regional Council Land and Water Regional Plan, or through the subsequent implementation groups that have spun out of that. So all I wanted to show you here is that there are a series of interventions that are in place to try and manage phosphorus, sediment and bugs, a whole suite that are in place to try and support and manage cultural and ecological health, and fewer, but a bunch of interventions that are there to try and manage nitrogen. So what I'm going to talk about a few of the interventions for managing phosphorus and a few of the interventions for managing nitrogen. So what's being done? So what's being done for managing sediment and phosphorus and fecals? So as we've covered, we know that sediment and phosphorus mainly move over land and in shallow subsurface flow. So they mainly move in areas where they're hydrologically connected. So the map here at the bottom shows the catchment, and so we've got three main areas of hydrological connectivity in the Selwyn catchment. So the first one, especially in conditions like now when the Selwyn is flowing, we've got sediment and phosphorus that has been lost from up in the top part of the catchment, up in the foothills, can actually move down via the Selwyn when it's flowing down into the bottom part of the catchment, so it's hydrologically connected. From the western part of the catchment, where we have some areas draining from parts of the Port Hills, this is quite an important source of phosphorus. But the main area is in the bottom part of the catchment, just south of State Highway 1, where we have lots of paddocks and lots of farms that either via overland flow or via drainage are hydrologically connected to one of those lowland springs or drains. And so with this in mind, we've got these kind of particular areas of hydrological connectivity. With this in mind, one of the areas of focus, one of the activities is looking at farm practices within particular areas. So what we've got shown up here is something called the phosphorus and sediment risk map. So this is something, this didn't come out of the zone committee, it came out of Environment Canterbury a little bit later on. And the kind of pinky orange hatched areas are areas of that have a higher propensity to lose either phosphorus or sediment. And what the plan asks is for farms operating in that area to prepare a farm management plan and to pay a particular attention to how they manage sediment and how they manage phosphorus in those areas, and then to have that farm plan audited. Other particular on-farm activities for dealing with phosphorus, sediment and bugs is a particular suite of stock exclusion rules. So those are some of the interventions, a couple of the interventions to try and manage the load at source, but also I'll touch very briefly on one of the interventions that tries to, once phosphorus and sediment has been lost from the source, tries to attenuate it en route. So there's a significant investment both from the Zone Committee and from the Whakaora Te Waihora project on riparian margins. So planting up of riparian margins, where these things, if they're wide enough and if they're maintained in a particular way, can actually be a way of allowing phosphorus and sediment to drop out of the system and removing phosphorus from the system. So, what about nitrogen? What's being done about nitrogen? So we said before that because of the way nitrogen moves, almost everywhere in the catchment is hydrologically connected. So there are three approaches, three basic approaches that have been taken in terms of trying to manage nitrogen. Dilution, attenuation, and managing of the source loads. So the mechanism for dilution is basically the mechanism of replacing groundwater takes for irrigation in the top part of the catchment, so replacing them with imported surface water takes, so imported through via the Central Plains Water Irrigation Scheme. So what this does, it leaves more groundwater in the system because those irrigation takes can't be transferred. So it leaves more groundwater in the system. We have an increased water balance because we've got water coming from outside the catchment via the irrigation scheme into the catchment. A bigger area of irrigation, and so increased drainage. So we have more load, absolutely, that comes from as a result of the irrigation scheme, but actually a greater increase in terms of drainage, so more dilution. And then there's one other example of a more direct dilution. So in a couple of streams, a couple of lowland streams, have been particularly vulnerable to low flows. So a pilot project around a couple of streams has basically been to near the headwaters of those streams to dig some channels and actually drain clean water directly into those channels, where we get the water goes down into the groundwater and is quite targeted in its augmentation of those particular stream flows. So those pilot projects were going on for a few years, and I believe they've been quite successful. So the second approach is attenuation. So because of the way water moves in this catchment, the first real opportunity, once nitrogen has been lost from the catchment, the first real opportunity you have to do anything about it en route is the point that it starts to recharge to surface water. So through the just south of State Highway 1, through that kind of springhead zone. So there's been particular work, and I think this is through the zone committee, to have a look at those spring heads and start to restore and protect those spring heads to try and increase the ability of those spring head wetlands to denitrify nitrogen as the nitrate-rich waters as they pass up from groundwater through to surface water. There was also a report that was done, I think last year, from the Sewlyn Te Waihora. They commissioned a bit of research, which was looking at the potential for expanded, constructed and enhanced wetlands for taking out, and they found a potential for taking out quite considerable amounts of the annual flux of nitrogen in those springhead areas and also around the lake. So the third approach is about managing source loads. So the mechanism for this is where a catchment load that looks at agriculture, industry, sewerage, urban, looks at the whole thing and sets a limit on the catchment load. Okay, so it's restricting it at source. So in this catchment, that load has been allocated to individual users. But that's going to be the subject of a talk in a 4 weeks' time, I think, around on-farm. So I'm not going to talk about how it was allocated or the particular implications on farm. I'm going to be talk about the catchment load itself and how that was calculated. So this is I grant you, not particularly impressive schematic of the Sewlyn Te Waihora catchment. So we've got some mountains, we've got some plains, and we've got a lake at the bottom. But what we're trying to show is that there is a load, in this case of nitrogen, that's lost from the catchment. Okay, and that's called the source load. That travels over a period of time called the lag time. And there are particular processes that act upon that load. For example, as it comes up through a wetland, we might get denitrification. So there are some catchment processes that act on that load. And then at some point, you have a load that arrives in a receiving environment called the receiving environment load. We might also have direct losses, things that go directly, for example, atmospheric losses that go directly into that receiving environment load. But that doesn't equal water quality. So if we're interested in the state of the receiving environment, then we need to look at other factors as well, such as flows, other nutrients, physical habitat. So the way that all of those things combine, that's what gives us our state of the environment, our state of the receiving environment. So just looking at the catchment loads, the source load is often, so what goes in is often not exactly the same as what comes out. So the source load is often of a greater magnitude than what we see in the receiving environment as a result of these catchment processes. So that's something that numerically we call that the catchment attenuation factor. It's basically the one divided by the other, and I don't particularly have time to talk about that, but that's a whole world of complexity just wrapped up in that single thing, in the catchment attenuation factor. But for the purposes here, it's just basically one divided by the other. Looking at the source load is in fact made up of two different things. So it's made up of an unmanageable load in terms of nitrogen, and it's also made up of and the rest of it is a manageable load. So the unmanageable load is that which kind of derives from natural processes. So in Selwyn, if we said the unmanageable load of kind of base rate might be 2.5 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, the unmanageable load might be in the realm of 500 tons of nitrogen coming through a year. Interestingly, if you actually start farming the catchment, then I think your unmanageable load probably increases a bit. So I was looking at some work that came out of Rotorua, and they were looking at unmanageable loads in farmed areas, and they thought that the absolute limit unmanageable was actually at 4 kilograms a hectare, that if you're farming, you basically can't get below that. So if that was the case in the Selwyn, the unmanageable load at 4 kilograms base rate a hectare would be in the region of 800 or 900 tons coming through the catchment every year. The manageable load is basically what is a result of our activities. So if we're interested in making any reductions, then that's the bit that we need to focus on. We can split it down even further. We can split it into that manageable load into the agricultural and sewerage and industry, which is exactly what the zone committee did. The zone committee then needed to make a decision about the appropriateness or an acceptable catchment load. So any decision about the catchment load basically needs to take into account a few factors. It needs to take into account the interplay between the desired state. It needs to take into play the other factors, such as other nutrients or other catchment mitigations, which in this case were really important, and the actual load in the receiving environment. So it needed to take into account the interplay between those things. But the second thing, it also needed to take into account what is manageable, what is plausible, what is a reasonable or even possible decrease to put onto the source load. And so what the zone committee in this case did, they decided that the most that they could do, the greatest possible load that they could reduce for the source load was basically to take land use at 2012, operating at good management practice, and take the halfway point of those farms operating between good management practice and maximum feasible mitigation. So that's the most that a land use can possibly mitigate without changing land use. So they decided a halfway point, but all of the land uses in the catchment 2012, that a halfway point between good management practice and maximum feasible mitigation was the most that they could expect from the source load. So the catchment load was calculated reasonably simply by taking the land use in 2012, so all of the losses from the land use in 2012 at their baseline losses. Then adding a certain amount of nutrients for CPW irrigation scheme. So remember when the zone committee started their limit setting process, that the CPW irrigation scheme had already been granted consent. So Environment Canterbury were required, they needed to provide some nutrients for CPW to exercise their consent. So we've got a baseline losses at 2012. We've got an addition for CPW, and then we've got another small addition that the Zone Committee decided that they wanted to give low-emitting land uses some flexibility. So it gave them essentially a flexibility cap. So we've got 3 additions: baseline, CPW, the flexibility cap. And then the reductions, we've got everybody moving to good management practice, and then all farms above, I think, a threshold of about 15 kgs of N a hectare, moving to this midway point between good management practice and maximum feasible mitigation. So what that basically gives us is a decrease in the amount of, in the phosphorus loads from the catchment. This whole package gives us a decrease in the phosphorus loads from the catchment, both in the lake and from the catchment itself, and an increase of about 10% in the nitrogen loads from in the catchment coming from current. So looking at what this package delivers us with this increase in nitrogen load, decrease in phosphorus load, increase in water, catchment mitigations, and particular interventions on physical habitat, we put those things together, and this basically looks at some of the modelling that we did for the Zone Committee. So we've got the Zone Committee priority outcomes, those for the Canterbury Water Management Strategy priority outcomes that cover social, economic, environmental, and cultural along the left-hand side. And then we've got how basically the more red it is, the more unlikely the package is going to deliver those outcomes. So we've got current. We've got scenario 1, which is what we said before about having all of the nitrates that's in the post having come through the system, and then the zip addendum. And so what we can see from this is that for most of the priority outcomes, the package of things that the Zone Committee put together, that's the loads, the water, the catchment mitigations, and the intervention on physical habitat, made an improvement for most of those priority outcomes, with the exception of groundwater. So groundwater, because of that increase in source and load, increase in groundwater nitrate concentrations led to a decrease in likelihood that they were going to meet the groundwater priority outcome. So that was where I was going to leave it today. So just in a nutshell, that it's not water quality just isn't all about nitrogen. We need to look at a range of things in terms of water quality. That the Zone Committee and Environment Canterbury have got a range of different interventions that they've put together that help deliver management of phosphorus, sediment, and bugs, ecological and cultural health, as well as nitrogen. That there's a source of information a source of really good information about water quality, and an invite for any questions.